Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Almost a Bride by Gayle Callen, narrated by Olivia Thompson. Prologue. London, October 1586. On the eve of her wedding, at a party to celebrate the joining of their families, Lady Roselyn Harrington laid eyes on her betrothed for the first time, and felt like tearing the flowers from her hair. Oh, Sir Spencer Thornton was handsome enough, with his dark, foreign, brooding looks. His mother was Spanish, but he'd been born and raised an Englishman, and would someday inherit his father's title of Viscount. But courtesy was beyond him. He was nothing like Philip Grant, her father's stable groom, who accompanied her on her wild gallops through the London parks as she tried to outrace her future. Philip was blonde and light-hearted, with sea-blue eyes she could gladly drown in. He understood and cared for her, and to be alone with him holding hands was as romantic as any poem. Thornton had obviously been drinking before he'd arrived at the celebration, because his laughter was too free and too loud. He stood across the room with his friends, looking the very picture of the court dandy. From his silk doublet, to his high neck ruff, to the pearl ear-bob dangling from one ear. Yet where his friends wore their beards dyed in outrageous purple or orange, Thornton was clean-shaven. He smiled broadly at every lady who passed him, be she maiden or dowager, and his teeth glimmered like moonrise in his dark face. But he spared not a glance for his betrothed. Smouldering with fury, she watched him and catalogued the sins he'd thus far committed during their short betrothal. He had never come to visit, never brought gifts. While every other young maiden was at least being wooed by her family's choice in husband, Thornton treated her as but a distasteful business. Philip's gifts might be only a handful of wildflowers and the pleasure of his company, but she felt cherished by his adoration, beloved. Thornton, on the other hand, had come early to their betrothal ceremony the previous week, and after signing the contract, had left before she'd even come downstairs. She'd caught only a glimpse of his back as he slammed the front door. Roselyn should have expected no better, since her parents had chosen her husband because of his money. When they had taken care of the contract without her, her father had said only, "Don't worry yourself, dearest." When she tried to ask about Thornton and his family, her mother had asked in a frigid voice, "Are you questioning our choice of your husband?" Roselyn had been so offended by the whole process that she went along with them, for after all, she didn't need to read that ornate tiny script when every marriage contract was the same. The groom would be well paid to marry the bride. But the groom could have made a small effort to pretend to court her, for the bride's sake. She had heard stories of Thornton's wild revelry, his attachment to Queen Elizabeth, his Spanish ancestry, which no one ever let her forget, and to think there might soon be a war with Spain, and she would be married to the enemy. She suspected every female friend of laughing behind her back, and every gentleman friend of deserting her. Finally, Thornton's father led him forward for the first meeting, and her own father, the Earl of Cambridge, gripped her elbow as he escorted her to the centre of the hall. "Lady Roselyn," Viscount Thornton said, his brown eyes filled with hope, "this is my son, Sir Spencer Thornton." Spencer Thornton glanced at her with those hooded, dark eyes, and a tremor of something, probably shock, jolted her. Then he looked away and swallowed another mouthful of wine. He was as dark as Satan himself, and she wondered if on the morrow the church would burst into flames rather than admit him. "Sir Spencer," said her father, "allow me to present my daughter, Lady Roselyn." Full of affronted pride, she wasn't even going to curtsy, until her father squeezed her hand in warning. With her chin high, she sank into a deep curtsy. Viscount Thornton gave her a warm smile, while his son stood stone-faced until his father elbowed him. Even then, he only nodded to her. Roselyn's outrage flamed higher, and she felt humiliated, knowing everyone was watching. Her betrothed and his friends left the celebration without waiting for the first dance. Alone, Roselyn watched them go from her place near the wall, her arms across her chest. How could she marry such a man? She wondered, glaring at her preening parents as they accepted the congratulations of the nobility. Thornton would probably send her off to his family seat in Cumberland, as far from London as one could get, without crossing the Picts' wall into the wilds of Scotland, just when she was finally of an age to attend the Queen's court. As the party guests began to dance, again her mind returned to Philip, who just this day had sworn his undying love for her, vowing to help her escape this forced marriage. She'd told him it could never be, but as she stood alone and contemplated a loveless match, she was more unsure than ever of what she should do. He was forbidden to her by class, by betrothal, but it made their time together wildly exciting. Could she have the unthinkable? A man who loved her for herself. On his wedding day, Spencer Thornton waited on the stairs of the church, his head pounding, his throat dry, and prayed for the nausea to subside. Some time before dawn he'd fallen into his bed, roaring drunk. But that was still not enough to make him forget the disdain in his betrothed's eyes. He'd handled the entire affair badly. But what choice had he? Spencer had done his best to ignore the poor girl his parents had picked for him, hoping that her family would end the courtship, but short of outright disobedience, and he loved his parents too much for that. There was nothing he'd been able to do but drown his rage in his cups. But he did regret his treatment of her last night. It wasn't her fault that his parents had resorted to the blackmail of needing an heir. If only they understood that he would never have the kind of marriage they had. Through the crowds gathered to stare, Spencer saw the approach of Roselyn Harrington's gilt carriage. A tight feeling of despair clutched his chest, but he straightened grimly. The bride was helped from the carriage, and her wedding garments glittered under the sun. Again, he saw that pale face, remembered the vulnerability of freckles scattered across her nose. He found himself hoping that they wouldn't hate each other. Roselyn took a step toward him, and stopped as their gazes clashed. Suddenly, she turned and ran. Spencer stood in stunned silence as he watched her dodge past people on the street, pull off her headdress, and throw it into the mud. Both sets of relatives moved about in pandemonium, shouting, pointing. Someone ran after her, but it wouldn't matter even if they caught her. The damage was done. Spencer stood as if he'd been turned into a statue, unsure what he was feeling. Shouldn't it be relief? Exultation? Everyone turned and looked at him, mouths agape, and a chill shuddered through him. He was used to creating scandal, and enjoyed making sure the nobility knew he was there. But not this way. His gaze darted from person to person, and soon they were whispering behind their hands. His own friends started to laugh, and the ensuing uproar reverberated through him. He'd forever be a laughingstock, an object of ridicule, and it was all Roselyn Harrington's fault. He looked at his parents, whose disappointment must be even worse than his humiliation. "Am I too late?" said a familiar voice. "Just got into town for the wedding of the year." Spencer glanced aside to see his brother, Alex, lurching up the church steps with a giggling, dressed-up doxy on his arm. "She left," Spencer said, wondering if his brother would take satisfaction in the rejection. "There will be no wedding." "But I wanted to meet her," Alex said with an exaggerated sigh. He slung his free arm around his brother. "Come on, Spence. Let's go. There's this tavern by the river." For the last time, Spencer looked down the street where his bride had disappeared, feeling the bitterness inside him freeze and become brittle. Then he turned and walked away. 1. July 1588. 2 years later. In the growing darkness, Spencer Thornton stood by the rail and watched the frantic sailors scrambling up the masts of the Spanish ship, loosening the ropes and sails in a desperate effort to alter their course. The English fleet still sailed behind, sending cannonballs screaming through the sky to topple masts and puncture ships. Death had been stalking him for days now. He was so weak from lack of food that his pretense of being a seasick soldier seemed real. He couldn't allow himself the solace of sleep, because one by one, other British spies were being murdered, and he might be next. He gripped the rail and stared hard at the Isle of Wight, with its shadowed cliffs and beaches. He had made plans to jump ship there, where he now owned dour property from that ill-fated betrothal. At least some good had come from his last London scandal. He would have done anything to escape the notoriety of his missing bride, and the British government had presented him with a way to be needed, a way to prove himself loyal. He'd spent over a year pretending to be a Spanish citizen, gathering information on the pathetic condition of the Spanish soldiers and sailors. The Armada's food and water were spoiled, and they lacked ample supplies of powder and shot. He was all but certain the Spanish couldn't invade England. All he needed to do was get his information to the Queen, unless the traitor killed him first. The ship was in uproar. Spanish soldiers huddled in sobbing groups, while sailors crawled through the rigging. Now might be his best, and only, chance to get the proof of treachery he needed. Spencer leaned over the side to check that the boat he'd lowered earlier was still lashed to the hull. Then he headed for the cabin of Rodney Shaw, a highly placed British spy, and the man Spencer believed was betraying his country. As he reached the door, an explosion rocked the ship, and the shouting intensified. He ducked inside the dark cabin, feeling his heart pounding against his ribs and the sweat rolling off him in the stale air. Footsteps pounded overhead. The ship shuddered with the impact of another cannonball. He frantically ran his hands over the table, through the trunks, beneath the bedclothes. He found only one sealed letter, and by the light of gunfire outside the porthole, he was able to make out the first few sentences. It was written by Shaw's Spanish superiors, just what Spencer needed. After stuffing the letter in an oilskin pouch, he strapped it to his chest beneath his shirt and was soon back in the shadowy corridor. He had taken only one step when he felt the prick of a sword in his back. "Signor," said a voice. Spencer held his hands out to his sides to show he was unarmed, then slowly turned around. He looked into the dark, smirking eyes of a Spanish soldier. Spencer braced himself against the bulkhead and wiped his shaking hand across his forehead. "Forgive me, sir. I am sick, and I was trying to find my way below deck to rest." The soldier leaned closer, keeping his sword at the ready. "My master is looking for you. And where do I find you? Right outside his door." An ease spread through Spencer's chest. This man worked for Shaw. But did he know what Spencer had found in the cabin? He allowed himself to be prodded on deck, where the growing darkness was lit with gunfire. He could just see the island disappearing off the port side. So much for his plans to jump ship before he was caught. The bow was deserted, except for the shadowy figures of 2 men. Spencer approached warily and received another sword prick in the back to hurry him up. Rodney Shaw, dark-haired and still amazingly well-dressed, stepped forward and smiled.
"Lord Thornton, how good of you to deliver yourself into our hands,"
he said softly in English. Spencer answered in Spanish.
"You didn't cover your treachery well, Shaw. Did you not think we would discover your secret? There is no longer a we, Lord Thornton. Every other spy is dead."
Spencer kept his rage contained.
"I don't understand why you would do this. Surely you knew that your loyalty would have been well rewarded by the crown."
Shaw only shrugged.
"Now I can be well rewarded no matter which side wins. And imagine how grateful the Queen will be when I hand her the name of the traitor, Spencer Thornton. I'll tell her what a shame it was that I had to kill him before he could kill me. And then, of course, when the Spanish invade, with my help, I shall be a hero to them as well."
Spencer's arms were suddenly gripped from behind. Before he could do more than briefly struggle, he felt a blow to his stomach, then to his face. Pain shot through him, and he tried to pull away. Shaw and another of his henchmen took turns pummeling him, and Spencer knew they intended to beat him to death. He deliberately sagged in their arms, and when one of the henchmen leaned over him, Spencer plucked the man's sword away and rolled to his feet. Shaw's own sword suddenly glittered in the moonlight, and he laughed. Swaying, Spencer blinked his eyes as his vision blurred, but he fought to hold his hands steady. When their swords arced overhead and rang together, he felt the rippling shock of it clear down to his chest. He desperately fought on, wondering which blow would be his last. His breath came in laboured gasps, and sweat dripped into his eyes. When he stumbled to one side, he felt Shaw's sword pierce between his ribs. Even if he managed to defeat Shaw, the Spaniards were just waiting to take Shaw's place. With one last blow, Spencer knocked Shaw a step backward, then grabbed the rail and vaulted overboard. For only a moment, the wind whistled past his ears. He landed in a crumpled heap in his boat, feeling a shattering pain in his leg where it slammed into the wooden seat. Somehow, he managed to pull the knife from his boot and cut the ropes holding the boat against the Spanish galleon. Dazed and nauseated with pain, he rowed out of reach of the ship's guns, watching the fleet veer away from the treachery of the island.
"I'll find you, Thornton!"
echoed across the water, and a bullet whistled past his head. Once out of range, Spencer tried to staunch the blood flow at his side, using his shirt. Then he rowed northwest, to where the chalk cliffs of the island rose out of the sea, to guide him through the darkness. On dark nights, on the low cliffs overlooking the English Channel, Roselyn Grant could almost forget that the English and Spanish fleets were resting at anchor, waiting for dawn to renew their battle. Tonight, the moonlight wouldn't allow that, illuminating the masts rocking out on the waves. Occasionally the flash of a lantern winked at her, and she could hear a sailor's shout, sounding eerily close. Many of the island's people had fled to the mainland, leaving the villages half deserted. But she had rebuilt her life here, and she would stay until the Spanish invaded, if necessary. She had no other place to go. The wind off the channel was as chilly as the rest of the cool, wet summer had been. Roselyn tugged the kerchief closer about her shoulders and closed her eyes, breathing deeply of the salt air. Her usual nighttime peace eluded her. When she opened her eyes, she stared in shock at a small boat, silhouetted in the moonlight, rocking wildly in the breakers close to the beach. For a moment, she thought they were being invaded, but the solitary boat looked empty as it was tossed ashore and overturned. She told herself to run away, but the impetuous Roselyn of old suddenly appeared, as if the last 2 years hadn't happened. She found herself descending the path to the beach, skidding on gravel, grabbing clumps of weeds to steady herself. Her curiosity had awakened from its long dormancy and could no longer be appeased. After all, it might be a perfectly good boat. She walked unevenly down the sloping sand, stepping over broken spars and split casks, remnants of the sea battles. She slowed as she reached the boat, which was resting against a boulder, but it was empty. Then she heard a low, ragged moan. Roselyn froze, taking a deep breath before peering cautiously around the far side of the boat. For a moment she thought her mind was playing tricks on her, that it was only the gulls she'd disturbed. In the roar of the waves, she could imagine anything. But she heard the sound again, and this time a dark shadow moved. It was a man sprawled face down across the wet sand, his lower body buffeted by the surf. Roselyn cautiously crept forward as he moaned more softly, as if his strength were ebbing with the tide. She crouched down beside the man's body, gathered her courage, and tugged on his shoulder to roll him over. His arms splayed out to his sides, his head lolled. Above a ragged beard, his face looked distorted, misshapen, and she saw the darker shadow of welling blood below his eye. With a groan, the man shuddered, and Roselyn scrambled away from him. "Help me." He sounded like an Englishman, not a Spaniard. Relief flooded through her, and she sagged to her knees at his side. "I'll go for help. I promise I will not be long." Before she could stand, he reached a trembling hand toward her. "No, please." He gripped her fingers with a strength that surprised her. His skin was wet and frigidly cold as he seemed to will her with dark eyes to heed him. She felt caught, trapped in his gaze as the moist wind swirled around them. Roselyn licked the salt from her lips as she released his hand. "I cannot carry you alone, sir, and I think there's blood soaking your shirt. You might be badly wounded." "No, the Spanish, they'll be coming." With a groan, he rose up on one elbow. "I can walk." She knew she should go for help now, before the man injured himself even further, but he had already dragged himself up into a sitting position. Resting his chin against his chest, he took ragged, deep breaths that convulsed his entire body as water ran in rivulets from his long dark hair. "Sir," Roselyn began doubtfully. The sailor groaned as he rolled onto his hands and knees. She gave up trying to persuade him to be still, and reached down to help him. He clutched at her shoulders and almost knocked them both to their knees in the surf, but somehow she withstood his weight. He smelled of brine and sweat and blood, and as he threw his arm across her shoulder, the cold ocean water seeped into her clothing. When he reached his full height, she realized that even injured, he could be formidable. Together they took a few staggering steps across the sand. She could tell that something was wrong with his right leg by how little weight he put on it. Roselyn cursed herself with every exhaled groan he blasted in her ear. He was too big for her. What was she supposed to do with him? Take him all the way to the Lord Lieutenant? Though she thought every staggering step would be his last, he never faltered. During the climb up the cliff path, they had to stop several times as the sailor braced himself against the rock wall and gasped for breath. "Let me go for help," she pleaded again. "No." He could barely whisper, but still he clutched her skirts to keep her with him. She wondered what kind of man he was, to force himself beyond his strength. She could see only the barest outline of his profile in the dark. A bold nose over an unkempt moustache and beard. He wasn't even using his right leg anymore, just her body as a crutch. They reached the meadow above the cliffs, and she thought the sailor would sag to his knees in relief. Instead, his entire body trembled as he held on to her, resting. Roselyn's own legs were weak, and she felt disoriented. She was helping a strange man through the stark, moonlit field, and she didn't know what to do next. He hung from her shoulders, head down, his bare feet buried in the high grass. Though he was a British sailor, she did not dare bring him to her own cottage. She would take him to a shed on her father's lands, where she could tend to his wounds before going to the Lord Lieutenant. Not that the militia in the nearby village of Shanklin would have much time for one stray sailor. They were busy digging trenches and scouring the island for powder and shot, in case the Spanish invaded. They half-limped, half-staggered through the night. Hours could have passed, and Roselyn wouldn't have known. She would have been grateful to run into one of the patrols, anything to have help with the ever-increasing burden of the sailor. She was exhausted by the time she reached Wakesfield, her father's estate, where the outbuildings loomed in the distance. "'Tis not far," she gasped. But speech was beyond the sailor's capability as he clung to her. She could feel the bones of his hips and ribs against her, as if he hadn't eaten in a long time. By the saints, what would she do if he died? When they reached the shed, Roselyn shouldered open the wooden door, and the sweet smell of drying grasses from the mill pond wafted out toward them. Without a sound, the man dropped onto his knees, then face forward into the pile of grass, almost disappearing into the black shadows of the shed. She could see nothing without a lantern, so she rolled him onto his back and listened to his shallow breathing. "I shall return in but a moment," she said slowly, hoping he understood. "I'll bring bandages and food." Roselyn left him and ran across the grounds, past stables and barns, the orchard and the gardens. Her father's manor was dark and silent, with only the bailiff, Francis Hayward, and his family living there. The moon reflected off the panes of the windows like a single bright eye, following her. Her parents had no idea that she'd sought refuge there. If they knew, they would banish her. She'd refused to jeopardize Francis's position by living in the manor, and instead lived in one of the cottages. A candle glowing in the small glass window of her home welcomed her inside, where the faint smells of supper still hung in the air. She retrieved a bucket of hot water off a hook over the fire, then put linens, salves, blankets, bread, and a horn of drinking water in a sack she hung over her shoulder. Next, she searched for some of Philip's garments, buried at the bottom of a chest. When she returned to the shed, she set about removing the sailor's sodden clothes. Finding an oilskin pouch strapped to his chest, she set it aside in the grass. As she tugged down his breeches, she told herself that he was just another man to heal, but feeling his naked skin beneath her hands made her oddly unsettled. After a quick, wide-eyed stare, she put a towel discreetly across his hips, then examined the jagged gash in his side, obviously caused by a knife or sword. He groaned when she touched his right leg, and she felt a swelling at his shin. He must have broken the bone. Though his body was leanly muscled, it was obvious that food had not been in plentiful supply on board ship, for his ribs were too evident. Roselyn cauterized the bleeding wound in his side, cleaned the rest with wine, and applied salve. Then she bandaged his ribs and made a splint for his leg. The sailor's trembling eased as she covered him with a blanket. Before dawn, the man began to toss and groan in a fever-induced delirium. He seemed panicked, desperate, and she wondered what horrible memories plagued him. When he began to mumble, she froze in stunned surprise. The words were not English, but Spanish. She had grown up near seaports and knew the language enough to recognize it. but not enough to
Sample complete. Ready to continue?